Hon David Parker.
Mr Speaker, we heard it again at question time today, where the government tried to masquerade this fast-track legislation behind the merits of the earlier versions. Mr Speaker, we've had two prior versions of fast-track. The first was the COVID response fast-track, and the second was embedded on a permanent basis through the Natural and Built Environments Act, which repealed the RMA and carried fast-track forever. But there are major differences between those forms of fast-track and this one that is in this legislation. And some members have already covered it, but I'm going to reiterate what I think are the important differences. Mr Speaker, the opposition parties, including the Labour Party, have long acknowledged that there is a problem with excessive costs for consenting mid-size infrastructure particularly. Not so much the larger infrastructure, but the mid-size and smaller infrastructure projects in New Zealand. The cost and delay of consenting has been excessive, and we in government proved it through the Infrastructure Commission that we set up, and we remedied it, Mr Simeon Brown, through the legislation that we passed. 90%, more than 90% of the projects that went through that fast track were eventually consented. Less than 10% were declined, and they were declined for good reasons. Mr Speaker, that was achieved by focusing on the speed of the process, not by overriding the laws which govern the balance between development and environmental harm. Mr Speaker, there was no need to override the Resource Management Act. We, in our version of fast track, consented wind farms, solar farms, the biggest solar farms ever to be built in New Zealand, consented under our fast track. We consented roads, we consented geothermal. In the next version, renewals of hydro were also able to be fast tracked, but not new hydro projects, which forever alter the environment of a river system that is dammed and inundated. Mr Speaker, we consented whole new towns. We consented thousands of building opportunities, high-rise, some in some new subdivisions. We consented factories. I think for Simeon Brown, he'll also be aware that we consented roads. Not once did we have to override the Conservation Act, or the Wildlife Act, or the Resource Management Act, or the Historic Places legislation, all of which are necessary. Now, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, a former National Party Minister for the Environment, has held the highest ever office of a New Zealander in an environmental role overseas, and that he was head of the OECD Environment Division, came to the Select Committee and said, this legislation is worse than the National Development Act. 1979, I think it was, passed by Muldoon and removed by the following Labour government because it went too far. But he said that legislation had more checks and balances than this, because that legislation meant that you had, for a large project, a thorough process that people could participate in. The contentious issues could be critiqued, they could be worked through, and a consent was either approved or at the end of it declined. Under this legislation, there is no environmental test to speak of, because the rules in the Conservation Act can be overridden, and the Wildlife Act, and the Historic Places Tract legislation, and the Resource Management Act. And that means that the environmental outcomes can be worse. Now, what does this mean in practice? We've heard from other members that it means that things that couldn't be consented under the old regime now will be. And what are they? They are things that will make New Zealand worse place to be in. They will extend the life and extent of coal mines. Does many people in this House think that's a good idea? That you should fast-track more greenhouse gas emissions? The outgoing the chair of the emissions agency, Rod Carr, said digging up more fossil fuels is a crime against humanity. That's pretty strong words from the leader of our response on climate change, and he was right. And that's what this bill does. It enables more fossil fuel extraction. I know, while we hear Simeon Brown, look, he's even worse on energy than he is on roads. This is the man that would double New Zealand's electricity price by importing LNG. That was his response to a dry year this year. A complete overreaction, just like we had with Nicola Willis on the ferries. Head in the sand as to what are the long-term solutions to energy challenges, which involve backing up our hydro, our intermittent renewables in a dry year. They do not involve importing LNG, which would double the price of electricity in a dry year. Now, he's learned that since, because he shut up on that particular dumb idea that he took to the country just months ago, because he was so embarrassed when he actually saw the advice as to what would be the effect on electricity prices. But those sorts of projects, dumb though they are, could be fast-tracked under this legislation. What else can be overridden? Do you know, we haven't got many rivers protected in New Zealand under water conservation orders, but every one of those water conservation orders is at risk now under this government, because they would give themselves the right to override a water conservation order protecting an outstanding river, and they have to be an outstanding river to be protected in that way. What's going to happen to some of the council costs? Under our fast track, we didn't override a plan. If a plan said you shouldn't subdivide in that particular area, you had to go through a plan change. You couldn't override it through a consent with the approval of a minister saying, oh, we know better. We're going to force those infrastructure costs upon a council by having an out-of-order subdivision over there, even though there's no libraries and pools, and we're going to have to put in more libraries and pools, and there's not decent roads, and there's no public transport for people to use. We're going to override that, and we're going to have a subdivision over there. Quite unprincipled and wrong, Mr. Speaker, and unnecessary, as we proved with our version of fast track, because plenty of subdivisional opportunities were created under that legislation. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is based on a false dichotomy. It says that you cannot have environmental protection and a clean environment. It's just wrong. If you do it right, you can have both, but you don't achieve that by having a development-only test in the legislation, enabling ministers to override other legislation. You don't achieve that if the only people who can appear as of right are the people who are the applicant and the adjoining landowner. Under our legislation, Business New Zealand could appear, but so could the Environmental Defence Society. And as a consequence, important information would be put before a decision-making panel before that decision was made. None of that information can be guaranteed to be required now, and there is no environmental voice that is required by this legislation. So I think that the minister, the former Minister for the Environment, the Honourable Simon Upton, was right when he said that if you're going to have these extraordinary override powers, you should reserve it for projects that are of a public benefit. Now, I agree with Chris Bishop that not all projects with a public benefit are necessarily owned by the government or local government. I agree with that. But that's not what he was saying. He was saying that if there's a project for a public benefit, you should have these override powers on rare occasions. You do occasionally need them. Legislation already allows for them. National direction that is meant to protect the environment already has very wide exemptions for infrastructure. So you can put a road where necessary through a wetland or through an area which is a bird habitat, if that's the only place that the road can go. There are already exceptions provided for that. Similarly, in respect of other infrastructure. And if the government really thought we had a problem with being able to consent infrastructure under the existing regime, they should say projects with a public benefit as opposed to a private benefit like a private subdivision or a mine, that you should reserve it for those public infrastructure projects rather than conferring these overrides of environmental legislation to the private sector. That's what he thought. He didn't like this legislation, but he said if you're going to have those override powers, limit their application. Mr. Speaker, the other thing is there are some projects that are just so big and contentious that the public will never be satisfied if there isn't a process that allows their voice to be heard. And there are sometimes contentious projects that nonetheless ought to be consented, but you'll never settle down public disquiet if you exclude the people from the process. And that's one of the things that the other fast track thing didn't do. It didn't impose the will of government in respect of those serious issues where there should be some public process prior decision being taken. So, Mr. Speaker, this is far worse and different to the earlier versions of fast track.